So today we're going to be talking about the product design timeline, which is basically how we kind of want you as designers to walk through the design process and how we're going to be making prototypes and all of that. So just to begin, I do want to give you all a quick overview of just what to expect in terms of how you're actually going to be making this project. So around the end of bootcamp is when you're going to be assigned your nonprofit team, as well as you're going to find out who your PM partner is. So we're hoping to do that pretty soon as you all are introduced to our nonprofits for this year. And we also want to make sure that you are a little bit ahead of finding out before others, just because you're going to be more involved in the early stages of this process. And then by the end of fall quarter, we're hoping the PMs are going to be able to complete their product requirement documents, which are the PRDs. And that's going to be super helpful for you all in designing your designs and creating ideas for how to solve the problem that you're presented. And then in addition, at the end of fall quarter and early in winter quarter, we're hoping that you all start your design research as well as brainstorming and prototyping and all of that. And then winter quarter is really when you will be finishing your designs and prototypes, and then we can begin the development process as well. So now to kind of move on. Oh, and also feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to answer them. It's only two of us, so feel free to just jump in whenever. So now I'm going to move on. So this is kind of the way that this is a cool graphic that Nationals gave us. And so this is kind of how we want you to be thinking about design. So to start, we always want you to start with the context of your nonprofit. So, you know, who is your organization? What do they need? And how can we achieve what they need? So that's where we really want you to start at all times. And then we also want you to consider the product itself and why what you're designing is important to them. So those are what we want you to keep at the forefront of your mind whenever you're trying to think of a design that could help them. And then only after you have an idea and have the context did you start to kind of formulate what you actually want to make them. And this design process is going to be fluid. It's going to be a lot of back and forth and moving around. And so your prototype is likely going to change a lot, and that's totally fine. And that's why this kind of loop is infinite. You have to keep changing it, keep revising to make the best product possible for our nonprofits. And so that's the basic idea of how we want you to walk through this process. And there are some pretty clear-cut steps as to how we can approach this, but again, it's going to be iterative. It's going to be a lot of moving parts throughout this process, and we want you to just expect that and be ready for it. So the first kind of topic that I want to talk about that we're going to be working on until Thursday is user research. So this is going to be fairly in collaboration with your nonprofit partner, or as well as your PM. And so basically the idea of user research is to get a holistic view of your nonprofit partner, and your questions for this are going to be key. So many of the questions that you may have can be obtained from your PM's PRD. So I actually did want to show you what a completed PRD looks like if you may not be familiar. So let me pull that up real quick. So this is one that I actually helped work on last year. It was for EcoSlow. And so can you see that? Did that show up?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So in this document, we just, there are a lot of moving parts, but the thing that's really going to help you with user research is kind of the introduction, as well as it basically talks about the project scope. It talks about all of the moving components that are coming into this project before it's actually created. And so that's one thing that will be very useful for you when you're actually trying to figure out, okay, who is this nonprofit? How are we going to help them best? And so I just wanted to show you that real quick. I will actually bring it up again a bit later when we talk about a few other things. But so moving forward, we want you to be in contact with your nonprofit throughout this process as well. I wrote weekly in the presentation, but that can vary depending on you know, if you have questions that week, or if it's more of a slow week, or if it's a fast week, you may want to contact them more if you have more questions. But do not be afraid to ask your nonprofit questions, because that is going to give them what they want and what they will use. And so in terms of question generation, we talked about this a bit last week with the nonprofit discussion, but you know, these questions should be clear and concise and kind of guide your design strategy, whatever that may be. And it's also very personalized, you know. Everyone kind of has their own design style, and that's totally cool. So if, you know, at the end of the day, it comes down to keeping your nonprofit at the forefront of your mind. And so I did want to talk a bit more about questions. So let me move to that slide. So for questions, I do want you to keep in mind that these are a few of the areas that I think you should be hitting at as you're going through this process. You know, their mission, how they were first created, their structure, technologies that they do use, the role of the person that you're talking to, the challenges, strengths, you know, all of these things, as well as in relation to the problem itself. Figure out exactly what the problem is, the users who are going to be using it, how many, the features, all of that. And so again, this is all going to kind of tie back with your PM and what they wrote in their PRDs as well. So keep that in mind, that a lot of this information you will get from other people, but you are still going to need to be in contact with your nonprofit for a lot of this process. So now moving forward, I want to talk about your problem statements. So that's a pretty important part of this design process. So your problem statement is kind of like your guide for how you're going to start brainstorming ideas. And so it's kind of comprised of two different parts. One is the summary of the challenges that your organization has. Oh, hi, Ella. Welcome.
Hi,
So
sorry,
we're just,
I'm the
oh,
wrong.
no, it's totally fine. We're just talking a bit about the design process. So the first thing I just talked about was user research. If you want to go back and watch the Zoom recording, I'll send it later. But
Okay,
so we just
perfect.
talked a bit about user research. Now we're just talking about the next step, which is the problem statement. So with the problem statement, it's basically comprised of the summary of the challenges that you found in your org, as well as this concise statement about the fundamental problem that your design is going to fix. And so with that, I do want you to keep in mind again that the PRD is going to be useful with this, because they actually had a section that basically described the problem and the scope of the solution. So keep that in mind, that again, you will not be alone in this. And it's going to be, you know, it's going to be something that's going to help you when you start designing. So I think that was what I mainly wanted to talk about with that. So yeah, I already showed you the PRD, which is a great, reference. Okay, so then moving forward, now it's time to actually brainstorm, right? So this is where you kind of get to use your design eye, your creative process, whatever that may be. I'm going to be talking about some suggested brainstorming ideas, but you know, if you have a different one, that's totally fine. So I would like to start and say that this is an extensive process, and it's going to be something that you need to spend a lot of time on, and it's probably gonna get a little bit frustrating sometimes, because you're gonna have to keep brainstorming, keep coming back to your, you know, ideas, and it's gonna be cool, but it's gonna be frustrating at times, I'd imagine. So you know, while you're designing, you're definitely gonna have more questions, especially when you actually start figuring out, like, oh, what part of the problem is this going to solve? What part of the problem is this going to solve? How does this problem change based on what I'm designing, you know? Again, something Elena said that I think is really good is that you need to fall in love with the problem, not a single solution. So keep that in mind. And as I talk about this next slide about kind of figuring out, okay, how am I going to actually solve this problem? Keep that in mind. And there are many ways to approach this strategy as well, not just the one I'm about to discuss. So then now I'm going to just talk a bit about breaking down your problem so that you might be able to figure it out in different parts in terms of design. So again, you're going to be using your problem statement for this. So to start, I'd like you to, in this process, break down your initial problem statement, because it might be, like 1 or 2 sentences, but there are probably multiple problems within that one problem statement. And so um, for each part, start to come up with different solutions to the idea. But what I would like to say about that is that it does not necessarily matter if the idea is something you think is feasible, or even if you like hate the idea. I think what you need to do is still write it down. You need to um, just kind of word vomit everything that comes to mind when you're brainstorming. So um, something that I think is an effective strategy is to set a time limit, and then maybe just make a Google Doc and start writing every single thing down that comes to mind in terms of how to solve this problem, because it doesn't necessarily matter like what you're writing. It matters that you're thinking about different ways to approach the problem, and that is what is really going to be the most successful as you move forward in the design process. So then the next step is kind of just, once you have this fat list of ideas, like plenty of things to kind of pull from, start finding the ones that stand out to you. Start finding the ones that you think are the most feasible, or you want to move forward with for whatever reason. They make an impact on you. You can just highlight those on a Google Doc, or if you like use post-it notes, you can go ahead and pull those post-it notes and do it that way. But then after you've kind of decided on a few that you like, then you have to start analyzing them. You have to analyze, how will this impact the organization? How feasible is this for my developers? Analyze its strengths, its weaknesses, the opportunities with that, its threats, all of that SWOT analysis. And so kind of breaking down, it's kind of like building up all of your ideas and then breaking them down based on how feasible they are. And so again, this is going to be a long process, and I would say that throughout the brainstorming process, you talk to as many people as possible to pull from as many different sources as you can. So that's kind of the brainstorming process in a nutshell. So now moving forward, I'm going to talk a bit about prototyping, but I also don't want to talk too much about this because this is the focus of our next presentation using Figma and all of that, which some of us have experience with and some of us do not. So we will be talking about this again on Thursday. But basically this is the mock-up that devs will base their user interface upon, based on kind of what we've discussed and what you saw with Ethan's presentations for the developers. But the general prototyping strategy is that it all comes from your brainstorming, right? So it's building those ideas that you found strong and you found good, and starting to build them further, break them down into different branches, build them up again. So I would recommend that you start with diagramming and sorting all of the information into charts, and this can be in many different ways. You can just kind of segment all of your design ideas. Again, it's very personalized, but breaking the problem down further will definitely help you in terms of building it back up into a cohesive design. And so one thing that I think will be very helpful is when you start actually figuring out how to design this, you need to start with just some sketches and some flow. So you know how with the HTML trees, Ethan kind of talked about those. Think about maybe how your design can implement those and look somewhat like the code that we've kind of learned about a bit, like how does H1 look different from H2? How does H2 look different from H3? That's just for text. How could you implement that with your designs as well? So I think that those are very important things to consider, and kind of what you should start thinking about with your initial sketches and initial ideas once you have an idea that you want to run with. And then moves on to the medium fidelity iteration. So that's kind of like moving it a step further. Once you have kind of the basic segments of your design, you start sketching. You start making sketch mock-ups. You start making growth on those low fidelity sketches that you started with. But then comes in the user testing. So I would say that this is probably one of the most important parts of being a designer, is to get feedback. And it can be kind of, I'll talk about this a bit more later, but it can be kind of unfortunate when you're asking for feedback and it's always just fix this, fix that. It's not good here. But you need to be doing that because that's going to help the nonprofit feel like use their product more. It's going to make it easier for them and it's going to make it the most successful product possible. So then the last part of this is the high fidelity iteration. So that's like your kind of final prototype with Figma. And we're going to be doing this a bit, but we're going to be doing it in a very short amount of time. So it'll be a little bit different. But so Figma is your mock-up, but I will say that you can make more than one Figma design, and you probably, it's not impossible that you will, because this idea is going to change and it's going to look different than you initially thought it would, likely, at most likely. So now I'm going to move on and talk a bit about working with your team. So how the designer actually fits into all of this. I know we've kind of talked about this a bit, but I do want to make some things a little bit more clear. So I do want to make sure that you all know that you'll be working closely with your PM in communication with them, as well as with your nonprofit partner. So one thing that's pretty important is that you should try to attend that meetings that they have organized, and they should be attending meetings that you have organized with your nonprofit. So it's kind of like, you're kind of like a team in that way. But that's something that's going to be pretty important when trying to figure out, you know, what the nonprofit needs, what you can do to support the nonprofit better through your design. All of that information is going to be very helpful for you as you design this product. So I'd say that to be an effective design and PM partnership, you need to be collaborating constantly and figuring out different ways to approach the problem and solve that problem statement that you started with. And again, these PMs are probably going to be pretty useful with their, you know, they may not be designers, but they may understand the nonprofit as well, and they're probably going to have some pretty good feedback for your designs, as well as just even contributions to your designs. How can you improve them, what they like about them? All of that is going to be very helpful for you as you kind of move through this design process. And so another really important part of the team structure and how you fit in with the team is working with the devs and the tech lead. So the developers are the ones who are going to be implementing your design through code, which is pretty cool, right? But at the same time, you unfortunately cannot expect that your beautiful, perfect design will look exactly how you started. And that is for many different reasons, you know. Sometimes code just doesn't work out exactly how you initially started. Sometimes it does, but it's going to be a little bit different, and you have to expect that. So I did actually want to show you what the PRD for EcoSlow. I don't know if you all looked at the EcoSlow product on our website, but here's what it initially looked like. This was what the PRD initially planned it as, and I can actually show you what it ended up looking like real quick. So let me pull it up. This is what it ended up. Oops, no, I wanted this page. This is what it ended up looking like. So pretty different, not the same color scheme. Pretty much nothing looks the same. But I did want to show you that just to get an idea that your design is going to change, but it's going to be the most helpful result for the nonprofit. And that's ultimately what we want to achieve. And so I did just want to iterate that working with your devs and tech lead is another important component to how you fit in with this project. So now moving forward, now we're moving on to user testing. So we're also going to be talking a lot more about this in a couple of weeks. But this is pretty much like where a lot of your design is going to lie. And it all kind of comes back to how you're working with your nonprofit and how you're getting their feedback. So when you're designing your solution, you should be conducting surveys. And when I say surveys, I mean more than not just like a Google form. It's actually talking with your nonprofit. It's having them use the design that you created and having them give you feedback as to what's not working for them, what they don't understand about your design. because that's ultimately the end goal, is trying to get them to understand how to use the product that we created. So surveys can come in many different forms, as I mentioned. I will say that meeting in person is essential when it comes to these. You can do Google Forms. We're still in the development process of trying to figure out how to conduct these surveys and how to best do that, especially given that we're virtual. So I will say Google Forms are likely going to be something that you're using, as well as some other kinds of, oh, hi, Elena.
Hi.
Again, this feedback is what's going to be used to kind of best help your nonprofit and figure out the final design. So now moving forward, I do want to just talk a bit more about iteration, because that's going to be pretty important throughout this process, and it's probably going to get a little bit frustrating at times, because you are going to be redesigning this likely more than once, and parts are probably going to need to change, maybe the color, the layout, the entire structure, depending on the feedback from your team and your nonprofit. And I will say that you need to look at this negative feedback in a positive way. It does not reflect poorly on your design, or on your design abilities or anything like that. It's part of the process, and try to get as much feedback as you possibly can, because this is going to be the best way to make the most usable products for our nonprofit partners. And even if it gets frustrating sometimes, that's okay. I know it kind of sucks that it might feel like your idea just keeps getting trashed, but again, this is for the nonprofit, and it's totally going to be okay in terms of your design. You are going to create an awesome design. I know it. I know you all are very talented people, and try to keep that negative feedback in a positive light, because it'll be most beneficial in the end. So going on to your task for this week. So we're basically going to be working with a little problem, so I'll just go ahead and read it for you all. So Anna is the manager of a local nonprofit in SLO County called Environment for All. Environment for All works to support environmental justice efforts in SLO County. Among their various duties and responsibilities, a major component of their work is to coordinate volunteer garbage cleanups throughout San Luis Obispo, from Bishop's Peaks to Cal Poly's campus. Anna has realized that after years of work, she is extremely overwhelmed with how disorganized her current system of tracking garbage cleanups are. So at the cleanups, volunteers take care of what garbage they have found in a particular site, such as in downtown SLO or in the trails of Madonna Mountain. The data is currently stored in paper form, which have become very organized and unmanageable. Anna is tired of searching through, I said Excel spreadsheets, but it's okay. So Anna is tired of searching through her disorganized Excel spreadsheets with random information, and is having trouble finding out how much of an impact Environment for All is making on the environment in SLO. And so that is the problem that we're kind of going to be working with throughout the next couple weeks in our little design boot camp. So based on the information that I kind of talked about today, you all are going to be emailing your nonprofit partner representative, who's me, with your questions as to how you can approach this problem. So based on kind of the questions that we talked about today, we're going to be approaching it as if I were a real nonprofit. And I will say, please keep it around 8 questions in this email. But I want you to all email me your questions, and I will respond to you with in that email. If you want to, you can also Slack message me. That's okay. But I want you to email me your questions, and then with that, I will respond. And I want you to then go ahead and generate a problem statement, kind of like what we talked about, and begin brainstorming an idea for how you could solve this problem. So I know it's pretty broad, and I want it to be that way, just because this is kind of where we're starting for the actual nonprofit projects. And so please keep in mind that I understand that this is going to be a very condensed timeline, and we're going to be starting prototyping on Thursday, but this is just to kind of simulate some of the things that you will be experiencing throughout the next quarter and throughout this product design process. So I know this was a lot of information kind of in a very short amount of time. So does anyone have any questions about what you're supposed to be doing, or anything that I talked about in the slides, or anything in relation to design. Okay, cool. Well, if there are no questions, then that's about all I have. I believe I will be sharing these slides, and I do have some resources on there, including some resources about question generation if you're a little bit confused on that. But yeah, so just try to get your emails to me about the whole design task that I kind of talked about a bit earlier. But if there is nothing else, I think you all are free to go. Thank you for listening to me, and I appreciate your attention and all of that.